Hi, this is Monty Young. Thank you for joining me for my conference presentation of First Do No Harm, Fixing a Broken Assessment System. Um, Grading is not exactly my favorite part of teaching, but throughout this course, it's become something that I have become very passionate about because I've realized some of the ways that our traditional assessment system is fundamentally broken and that there are solutions out there that are a better fit for my students and that I think are a better fit for education in general. So I want to start off today with just a big question, which is why do we grade? And when you think about that, it might be because we've been told that's what we do. How else are we going to know what students know? Or maybe that because our district has told us that we have to enter grades, or that parents expect grades, or that students will work for grades, or that they like grades, or that they like knowing points, or that they like knowing where they are in the class. But none of those reasons actually assist students in learning. And it doesn't really matter what grading system you may use or what grading system your district might use. Those grading systems are inherently harmful. The reasons that traditional grading systems are broken are many and varied, but over the course of my research, I have found many things that are typical between all grading systems that you might use in your building or in mine that cause problems for students. First off, traditional grading practices are harmful because they rely on extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is not nearly as powerful as intrinsic motivation, but when you tell a student that they are doing a job to get a grade, we know those students who are shortcutting to that grade. That can be very problematic because in real life, we don't work to get a grade. We don't learn to get a grade. We say that we want our students to be inquisitive, that we want them to take chances, that we want them to try things that are outside of their comfort zone and learn and grow. But those things all require intrinsic motivation, learning for the sake of learning, knowing the value in that. When you rely on extrinsic motivation, you strip away the intrinsic motivation. You can't have both. Our traditional grading practices are also harmful because they penalize risk-taking and creative thinking, the very things that we've said that we are dedicated to making sure our students know how to do. Our students are smart. They know this game. We've been teaching them this game for a very long time. And if we give them options and they know that their work on those options is going to be graded, they'll choose something that they feel is going to be easier, something that they feel is going to be within their comfort zone, something that they will be successful using the rubric that you're planning on using, instead of something that might be more beneficial to them or might actually make them grow. Studies have even been done that showing that just the very act of knowing that you're going to be assessed on something creative severely limits creative thinking. Part of that is because knowing that a grade is coming distracts from the process of learning. It makes it so students are constantly asking, how am I doing? Where am I at? Instead of, do I understand this? Can I apply this? Constantly needing to know how many points something is worth or where you are on that kind of fear-based spectrum. It's a little bit of the carrot and a little bit of the stick. Are you going to get the points that are going to move you into things in society that are valuable to you, or are you going to potentially have to fail, repeat a class, have the stigma associated with that? All of that is a distraction from the process of learning. And our traditional grading practices are harmful because they're inherently imprecise and subjective and flawed. They rely on a lot of assumptions that we'll come to talk about here in a minute that can be quite harmful to students, that can work to marginalize students. Also, unless you have standardized something to the point where you have come to an agreement with the people who are grading that they will put aside all normal subjective reactions that they would have as a reader and only grade for a very small number of specific things, you're going to have wide variation in grades of the same paper by different instructors. So we can't pretend that grading to a set of standards in one classroom is truly preparing students to be able to achieve those standards in another class, in another setting. The transfer just does not set up that way. Something that was a bit of a shock to me as I started doing this research, but became very obvious, and I felt really kind of upset with myself for not noticing this before, and even more dedicated to making changes to this in my classroom in the future. Traditional grading practices that rely on judging writing to a white academic standard are inherently racist. The writing standards that exist select one very specific type of voice as acceptable and deny the value in any others. It denies our students of color, it denies our students who speak more than one language, it denies our working class students. Basically, we are asking every single one of our students to mimic a standard academic voice, which is that of a middle class white man. And in my classroom, there's not a single one of those inside of our walls. So why am I grading students against that standard? These grading practices marginalize students who do not speak academic style English, which is created through white privilege and works to keep systemic white privilege in place. If we're looking to uphold an anti-racist pedagogy, we have to take a look at how our standards are actually perpetuating that very same racism that we might be working to eliminate. All right, so what can we do about it? That's some pretty heavy stuff because it's difficult to be like, okay, everything I've been taught, everything I've been expected, how can it be so wrong? We did not get into education to want to do something that was going to be harmful to our students. We want to help them and nurture them and make them grow and turn them into better writers and inquisitive thinkers and these beautiful little people that we know that they can be. How do we stop getting in their way through our grading practices? First thing is to stop grading based on quality. And that seems completely backwards. If you come from a school that tells you that you can't, give extra credit, or that you can't grade on effort, you can't grade on attendance, or there's lots of other things that we've tried to do, and everybody's been pushing toward standards-based grading or mastery grading or other systems that are supposed to make things more equal. But really, they just push things into smaller and smaller boxes that privilege a smaller and smaller group of people and strip away creativity from the rest. So if you have to give grades, because in many of our districts, okay, probably all of our districts, your administrators are going to ask you to give a grade. Parents are going to ask you to give a grade. So if you have to, if you are not in a position where you can completely abandon grades, reward the process, not the product. When we look into contract grading or labor-based grading, if points are awarded, if a grade system has to be used, it's all about, did you do this learning task that's going to help you? Did you revise, or did you collaborate, or did you contribute? It's not about the quality of those contributions. It's all about getting the moves done that actually create learning without penalizing whether that final product is in fact a final product. We know that students learn at different times, that at each moment in our own learning journeys, we are not fully done, okay? We don't have every idea fully conceived. We are not the same learners that we were 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago. Learning is a process, and we are much more likely to give ourselves the benefit of that doubt than we are with our students. We also need to trust our students that they will become better writers if we provide lots of supportive feedback instead of grades. A grade is, ooh, you got a 78 out of 100. What does that mean? What are we measuring that against? Does that automatically give student anything that is going to help them become a better writer? Or is it just going to go to the point where they're like, okay, I'll pass the class, or oh, I'm just a C student? What if instead, when they got that paper back, there was not a grade on it, but there was some comments about the structure or the writing voice, or just a heartfelt human reader reaction to the content in it that was not simply a justification for the grade that you put on the top, but was actually a truthful reader interaction with the text? Which of those two situations makes the student like their writing enough to want to make it better, to want to make it more clear, to want to come closer to finishing that process of thought and growth? If we're going to stop grading based on quality, we can still reach out and support metacognition and self-assessment. We want students to think about what they're doing, to think about the process of learning, to be able to understand where they are in that process, what moves they're making that are supporting that process, and what moves they're making that are getting in their way, so that they can help get a process that is going to make them successful in the future. We want to support inquiry. We want to support revision. We don't want to have to put all of these stop signs up and be like, oh, nope, that assignment's done. Let's forget about it. Let's make those same mistakes again on the next assignment. And finally, we've got to stop ranking students against each other or against these arbitrary and often racist standards. We need to start giving students credit for the work that they do, the effort that they put in, the processes that they complete, without using grading practices that are going to be truly harmful. Now, we taught students their worst habits. We taught them to avoid risk to ensure reward. We taught them that if they avoid challenging work and skate by, they can get good grades if we give them multiple options. We've taught them to focus on the product and to rush through the process as quickly as possible so that they can get paid for a grade. Nobody wants to do work that doesn't have a payout. So if we pay them for their process, to spend more time reading, to spend more time writing, to spend more time revising, engaging, conferencing, if that is what we tell them is worth the most, they'll spend more time doing the things that are actually learning instead of rushing through something to turn in and missing out on time that could have been spent making themselves better. And perhaps the most insidious part of this is that we have coerced our students to write and think just like us. Because whether or not we realized it, they know that we're holding their futures in our gradebooks. They know that if we disagree with them, we are more likely to notice other errors in their writing. They know that we are the standard that says whether their writing is good enough. And really, good enough is just a measure of how different their writing is from ours, or how different their thought process is from ours. And as much as we try to reduce the subjectivity from those decisions, and as much as we don't want to be that person who has accidentally coerced our students to think and write like us, I want you all to think of a classroom that you've been in where you have written what you knew the professor wanted instead of what you wanted to say, because you knew that that professor did not reward disagreement, or that that professor was perhaps easily targeting students who didn't completely agree with them or didn't seem 100% fair. None of us want to be that teacher. None of us want to put our students in that position. We can still hold our students to high standards of effort and of process without forcing them into being little mini-me's. So resources that you might find helpful if this is something that you'd like to look more into. One of the quickest, most accessible sources is Jesse Stommel. His blog's really good. I used his article, How to Ungrade, but he also has many articles out there about how to reduce using grades in your classroom. If you were able to go completely gradeless like he has for the last nearly 20 years of teaching, he gives suggestions for that. His district only asks that he submits a final grade, and he has his students come up with their own final grades after conferencing with him throughout the semester. And he's got a lot to say about how the feedback and authentic assessments that he uses help drive student growth rather than a grading system. Elfie Cohn is probably one of the most outspoken critics of standardized testing and overgrading in schools. Reading The Case Against Grades or Speaking My Mind, The Trouble with Rubrics are both really good sources. His website's a little old-fashioned, but it's pretty good. Esau Inouye, his labor-based grading contracts are the foundation of what I did most of my research on. He also has another shorter article called Theorizing Failing in U.S. Writing Assessments, which is fascinating. But this is the gentleman who really opened my eyes to the fact that our standards-based assessment system is inherently racist and upholds a white supremacist ideology that just goes unacknowledged through white privilege. And it has been really fascinating to interact with his work. I highly recommend it. And then we've got Jane Danielitz and Peter Elbow, who together wrote a unilateral grading contract to improve teaching and learning. Along with Inouye, these are probably the biggest names in contract grading. The universal grading contract is a pretty lengthy document, and you can check out exactly what they did to go gradeless, how they're using evaluations that are based solely in the characteristics of the text and helping to challenge students without actually giving grades on individual assignments. Peter Elbow's article, Ranking, Evaluating, and Liking, is another must read. He talks a lot about the difference between ranking, which is what most of us would think of as grading, putting, an A through F or a 1 through 4 or 1 through 100 on a paper, versus evaluating, which is where you actually give like descriptive feedback for something, versus just liking, which is a great way to kind of get into our students' work. And looking at those three forms of judgment and realizing that ranking is the most detrimental, and evaluating without grades, but just textual evaluating can be extremely helpful for our students. And then finally, the last one that I'm going to throw up here was Alan Blackstock and Virginia Exton's Space to Grow Contracts for Basic Writers, which is just a nice kind of entry-level article into seeing how grading contracts can work at different grading levels. They both teach at Utah State University, and they work with a really diverse group of students, some through distance learning, and they also teach on a Native American reservation, so that collection of their background and history does really nice things to round out that article and see how these writing contracts can work in a variety of circumstances, including with writers of very different kind of starting points. One thing that all of these writing contracts have in common is that they all give students a chance to be successful, no matter how close they are or how close they begin class to a kind of white dominant writing academic standard, because they're rewarding the effort, they're rewarding the process. If you think that you can be successful, you're more likely to be successful. And instead of taking students who may be a little bit further away from a dominant language ideology and telling them that they are failures because the system was designed to make them fail, and then placing them in remedial classes because the system decided that they needed to fail because they were different than the dominant language ideology, this is not a recipe for helping people who are already marginalized to realize their potential. This is not a recipe for us to be able to appreciate that language is dynamic and changing and profoundly cultural, and that there is value in language that sounds different than what we personally speak. So with that in mind, I'm just going to kind of wrap this up. Basically, my call to action is I would love you to take a close look at what you are doing in your classroom with grading and try to figure out ways that you can reduce it, that you can add more comments and fewer numbers. If you can eliminate grading completely, fabulous. If you can switch all of your grades to reward process without product, fabulous. If you can ensure that your grading scheme is not harmful to students, is not reducing their motivation, is not perpetuating racist stereotypes, is not harming students' ability to be wonderful creatures that are full of inquiry and wonder and that want to learn for the sake of learning, then bravo, please do those things. Thank you.